Beating Rutgers in triple overtime. Some would look at the good side. Some would look at the downside for Michigan football. We got Clayton Sayfie on the line from the Wolverine Mag on Rivals. Please join him and the rest of the staff there on Rivals. Clayton, how you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me, Mark. I'm excited. Talk
Absolutely.
about a win. We booked this last week, and I was a little worried we'd be talking about a Michigan loss to Rutgers and the doom and gloom, but still some doom and gloom. But let's talk about, a Michigan win that was much needed.
Yeah, down a couple scores in the second quarter, able to come back from 24-14 and a few other deficits to get it done in overtime and avoid the dreaded Rutgers loss, which wouldn't necessarily be as devastating as it would be in past years, but it still holds quite the stigma for the upper echelon of the Big Ten. So, Clayton, let's get right to the matter of the quarterback situation. Joe Milton looked good against Minnesota. He's fallen off since then. Obviously, there are contributing factors to that all around him on the offensive line and elsewhere. Lack of a running game. Your thoughts about his performance when the move was made, and if CADE McNamara is in a quarterback battle with Milton going forward, or if he's won the job?
Yeah, so, I think that opener against Minnesota was pretty deceiving when you look back at the fact that we thought Minnesota was a top 25 team, right? I mean, that was a top 25 matchup. Michigan goes in, plays really well offensively. But then you look back in hindsight and you say, okay, this is a Minnesota defense that lost a lot from last year and is not a good team. I mean, they're getting run over by everybody they play. And the Michigan defense actually played pretty well, too, if you want to go there. And Minnesota's offense doesn't look to be, as good as it was. So that game was deceiving overall. But Joe Milton specifically, I'd say that he had a good performance at the same time. They kind of made things easy on him, and maybe even the coaching staff knew that probably it was going to be a little bit of a struggle. Fast forward 3-4 weeks, and, he struggles against Wisconsin. He threw 2 picks to start that game, and he wasn't really the issue in the first couple losses of the year, but, he just doesn't quite have that consistency. I think he's lacking a little bit in his awareness of the game. He's got a huge arm, and everybody talks about that. But when it comes to converting on third downs, when it comes to, making the correct read or getting rid of the ball quickly when the blitz is in his face, he just hasn't been doing it consistently enough. So we see CADE McNamara come in late in the third quarter against Wisconsin in a blowout. CADE McNamara looks really good. He goes 3 for 3, leads Michigan down in a minute and a half on 4 plays for a touchdown. And everyone's like, okay, this is the guy, this is the guy. I'm saying pump the brakes a little bit because we've seen Michigan quarterbacks come in before, look good in a small sample size against, in garbage time. Look at John O'Corn in 2017. Okay. But then Milton struggles again, gets down 17-0. He wasn't the only problem on that offense. Like you mentioned, there's problems with the offensive line. They were missing 3 starters last week at Rutgers. They're down 17-0, and Michigan had to make the change and go with CADE McNamara, and now he's the hero, right? He comes in, he goes 27 for 36, 260 yards, 4 touchdowns throwing, 1 rushing. He was gritty. His arm was bleeding by the end of the game, and he's making play after play, leading Michigan to a triple overtime win. This is your guy going forward. Jim Harbaugh didn't say that. Yesterday at his press conference, he said that the team hasn't come in yet and they kind of wanted to inform the team first. But when he talked to the team yesterday, I can almost guarantee you that he went with CADE McNamara and said this is the guy going forward. I think that we went into that Rutgers game thinking this could be the last win for Michigan on the season. But now you look at, what their ceiling is with CADE McNamara. We still don't really know, but it looks a little bit brighter. The ceiling looks a little bit higher with a new guy under center, a guy that has shown he can command that offense. He has the situational awareness. I mentioned the Joe Milton, how there's a blitz in his face and he doesn't get rid of it, or, he doesn't see the guy that's open underneath because the blitz is coming. CADE McNamara had his first touchdown throw was to Cornelius Johnson, 37-yarder, I believe. Blitz in his face, gets rid of it. You think, oh, he's just trying to get rid of it because he's about to get clobbered. No, he saw his guy streaking down the middle of the field for a touchdown. And, then that kind of set the tone. And I think he's your guy going forward. So to answer your question, Joe Milton hasn't been horrible. He hasn't been the number one issue on this team, but CADE McNamara looks like a fix to some of those other issues just because of how good he's been in a small sample size. So we'll see what it is going forward.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. We bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the nation. Discussion, debate, and analysis every day. That's our mission. So please lock it in right here. If you subscribe, hit that bell for the notifications. That way you know when we're going live, which is every day, typically multiple times per day. We got Clayton Safey on the line from the Wolverine Mag on Rivals. So not everything was Joe Milton's fault. Part of that was a lack of a running game, which had a high ceiling and high expectations with 4 running backs coming back, and 2 in particular, Hassan Haskins and Zach Charbonnet, that were effective last year. Despite losing 4 offensive linemen, Jalen Mayfield was back, and the other 4 guys had experience and time in the program and minutes on the field. So any thoughts about why the running game has been so dismal for most of the season?
Yeah, so we were impressed after the Minnesota game, and we can talk about that game as kind of a completely different season. It feels like it was 2 years ago at this point because of how different things are now. But I'd say the number one thing is the injuries on the offensive line, not to make an excuse for Michigan, because there's really no excuse for combining for 60 total rushing yards in the Indiana and Wisconsin games combined. But Jalen Mayfield, like you mentioned, is a kid who's probably going to be picked within the first 3-4 rounds at the very least in April. And then you had to do some shifting. You also lost your left tackle in Ryan Hayes. This past game, they were without their starting center, 5th-year senior Andrew Vastardis. So they're playing some young guys that have a lot of promise. And Ed Warner, the offensive line coach, has done a really good job bringing some of his recruits in since he took over in 2018. So a lot of promise with these guys, but it's not the experience like you talked about. You were coming in with 4 new starters to begin with. So 4 new starters to begin with, but they didn't have that kind of experience. Now you're going to guys that were behind those guys and don't have any experience really. They've stepped in and done okay pass blocking. I really like, the way some guys have stepped in. Zach Zinter is a true freshman playing right guard right now, and I think he could, if Michigan gets healthier, you can move him over and he could actually replace the starting left guard, Chuck Filiaga, and do probably even better from what we've seen. But I'd start with the offensive line. Secondly, I think the running back rotation has been very bad, to be completely honest, through the first 4 games of the season. And it was one of the big complaints with Michigan fans through the first 4 games. Hassan Haskins, through the first 4 games, was averaging 7.8 yards a carry. And he got 1 touch against Wisconsin the week prior. Now, they had to abandon the game or the run game early in that game, but still, 1 touch, 7 snaps. He gets 22 touches last week, 110 yards, game-winning touchdown, goes over the top for the win in triple overtime. He's your guy there. I do think that the other guys have good skill sets. Zach Charbonnet is a guy who came in and had success in that second half last week. They all have a role, but I'm giving Hassan Haskins the ball 15 times a game. And if he proves that he's not having a good game, you do have other options. But why rotate with just no intent there? Why not go with the guy who's the hot hand? And it seems like that they're a little more willing to do that as of late. So I'd say the 2 factors play into it: the injured offensive line, the fact that the coaching staff has just made a huge blunder by rotating the backs, even though you have a clear number 1 guy and a clear number 2 guy in Hassan Haskins and Zach Charbonnet, respectively. So stick with that and see what happens. I think the offensive line is getting a little better by week, even the young guys. But if you get healthier, and we think Jalen Mayfield and Ryan Hayes could possibly come back this week against Penn State, then the running game could become, something that can really help out a young quarterback in CADE McNamara.
Please leave a comment below. Of course, smash that like button and subscribe right here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. We are talking maize and blue with a date against Penn State coming up. We got Clayton Safey on the line from the Wolverine Mag on Rivals. So the narrative on this defense has been a top 5 to 10 unit through the course of the season, get blitzed by Ohio State. I do temper that analysis when people throw that at me constantly, like it's been going on for 7 or 8 years. No, the Ohio State games were competitive, of course, no more than in 2016, but even the 2017 game was a quarterback issue, not a defensive issue for the most part. It's just been the last 2 games against the Buckeyes rolling in with the top 5 to 10 defense in the country and getting burned through the air. This season, though, the likes of Noah Vedral throwing for 381, coming into the game with 5 TDs and 7 picks. We've not seen Rocky Lombardi do anything against anyone else except for the Major Blue. Of course, the secondary has been a huge issue. So I got to think that there's been a talent issue with only Daxton Hill coming back and having to replace all those starters. But at the same time, maybe Don Brown's approach may be wearing thin.
Yeah, I mean, you look around the country and you look at Northwestern is a team that you could look at and say that has significantly less talent than Michigan, but why is their production so good? Why were they able to hold Wisconsin to 14 points last week? 7 points last week. Yeah. After Michigan allowed 49 to Wisconsin. I think that there's a lot of problems on this defense. And to be completely honest, to get the full story, you have to start with the opt-out of Ambry Thomas in the preseason, some concerns with the coronavirus, and you can't blame the kid. But then you look at the Michigan roster and you say, like you mentioned, there's nobody returning as a starter really, in the back end. Daxton Hill didn't start. He started a couple games last year because of injury, but even he wasn't a starter. Brad Hawkins was the only returning starter. At safety, the corners, Vince Gray was set to be a solid number 2 corner opposite of Ambry Thomas. But now he's thrust into being the number 1 corner. He's had confidence issues after struggling the first couple games. Jamon Green is a kid who stepped up a little bit as a redshirt sophomore, probably thrust into that number 2 corner role when he thought he was going to be maybe a year away from possibly starting. So you kind of move the timelines up of some of these guys. The roles are moved up. Vince Gray is now the number 1 corner. He struggled, like I mentioned. But it starts with the Ambry Thomas opt-out. And then you look at the front 7, who's also been gashed, in Wisconsin rushed for 341 yards a couple weeks ago on this Michigan defense, which is ridiculous. You have the injury to Aiden Hutchinson. He's out for the year with a leg fracture. Kwity Paye is out at least for the last couple weeks and could possibly return here in a couple weeks with a lower body injury. We're not exactly sure what it is. They're depleted, but at the same time, you mentioned the scheme is maybe a little worn out, a little run out. I happen to agree. The man coverage downfield when you don't have the horses isn't always going to work. They try to go to some zone at times, but that's not what these kids have been practicing, their entire careers at Michigan. So they struggle in the zone. The run defense, it has struggled. The injuries play a part in that, but they don't have enough beef on the defensive line. There's not enough talent, and these are all kids that Jim Harbaugh and Don Brown have recruited. So there's really no excuse for the lack of talent. You could say, sure, there would be a drop-off with some of the things that have happened, the injuries and the opt-outs, but to become they've been top 10, I believe, or top 11 in total defense every year when Don Brown's been here in the last 4 years. This year, sitting more than halfway through the regular season, albeit it's a shortened regular season. They're in the 90s in total defense right now. So it's an unprecedented drop-off for this defense, and the struggles are really all over the place. You mentioned the pass defense. They get roughed up in the run as well. They did a better job against Rutgers, but we've kind of talked about it. It's Rutgers, so we don't really know.
Yeah, the frustration is certainly transitioned from beating everybody that you're supposed to beat and coming up against the elites and not being good enough to just pretty much deplorable play across the board. I don't know that a unit's playing well on the team, maybe the wide receivers for the most part this season. We got Clayton Sayfie on the line from Rivals, the Wolverine Mag, and please join him and the rest of the staff right there. The Rivals brand, so check out their work. This is Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Best discussion, debate, and analysis. That's our mission each and every day. So Jim Harbaugh, for the people that watch me on a regular basis, I'm not going to go through the rant because I have one that I've verbalized about 1,000 times. But my basic take, Clayton, has been I can understand why he was hired. In addition to being a Michigan man, he did an exceptional job in the NFL and with Stanford in particular, and also San Diego. He gets hired, and he had to revamp a program that was 5-7. Still had talent on the roster, better than 5-7 talent, but did a nice job, of course, in years 1 and 2, and came that close, or depending on your perspective, maybe they overlapped and he actually had the first down, and who knows what the narrative and how it would have played out after that. But he had his team in position. They outplayed Ohio State in 2016, no question about it. So regardless, he continues on with fine recruiting classes, has a down year in 2017, but 2018, by every measurement going into Columbus, they were the better team. They had beaten common opponents so much more decidedly. They were the better team. They were the favorite. And then since then, it seems like everything's gone downhill, despite a decent season, of course, in 2019. So my narrative has always been, he's a good coach. He's done all the right things. He is facing one of the top 3 programs in the country. So on one hand, he's upgraded the program significantly. But on the other hand, he is being paid to win championships, and he's failing to do that. Now we go through this season, and there are conditions on it because of COVID, but at the same time, everybody's playing under the same circumstances. So where's your evaluation on his performance?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and I know there's a lot of frustration in the fan base. The national media, likes to pile on. Looking at it from, kind of a Michigan perspective, somebody who covers the team every day, I agree with you that he really did an incredible job of turning this program around after Brady Hoke and Rich Rodriguez, and was, it's not an easy job. And he made them really, like you said, they were better than Ohio State, I think, in 2016. They were the better team all year long in 2018. There's kind of a mental hurdle there. We mentioned Don Brown and that scheme, playing against superior athletes like Ohio State has. On the championship, side of things, it's going to be really tough for anybody to come in here and take this job and beat Ohio State, because Ohio State right now is operating like an SEC team. They're operating like Alabama, Georgia. They're operating like Clemson out of the ACC. And they're recruiting at that level, historic level. They're playing at a historic level. Last year, their offense was historically good in the Big Ten. I think it was the best offense since Michigan's point-a-minute team back in the early 1900s with, where they would score, a million points on whoever they played. So you have to take that into account. You have that in your division each and every year. I think it's disappointing what has happened since really the week before the Ohio State game in 2018, when they were favored going in. They get blown out 62-39. They get blown out by Florida in the bowl game. And then last year they almost lose to Army. They go to overtime. They get blown out at Wisconsin. There's too many debacles, I would say, with some of these games. At the same time, I think that he's done a lot of good. He's built the program up. He's dealing with a tough year this year. And I would stick with Jim Harbaugh as your head coach. I would take a long look at the defense and what you can do to fix some of those problems, who the coordinator might be going forward. I would take a long look at the offense as well, because Josh Gaddis is a second-year play caller now, coming from Alabama, where he was the passing game coordinator but didn't call the plays. You don't have much of an identity on offense. Michigan's always been a team that runs the football, is tough. And there's been games where they get roughed up against a team like Wisconsin that I keep going back to, but Wisconsin's a team right now that resembles the Michigan of old, and a lot of people are envious right now of what Wisconsin is. So long-winded way of saying, I think Jim Harbaugh is a very, very good coach. I think he is one of the best coaches in the Big Ten, and he's facing a rough season. This is an interesting stat that there's only been 5 teams since Jim Harbaugh's taken over Michigan that have won 8 or more games each and every year in the last 5-6 years. Now, obviously, Michigan's not going to do that this year with a shortened season. But it's 8 wins is not the goal at Michigan, not even close. And you have to win the championships. You got to beat Ohio State at some point. But at the same time, it shows that he hasn't had that bad year. This is it right now that everyone else has had outside of Clemson. I believe Oklahoma's in there. I believe it's Alabama and a couple other teams. So it's not an excuse. 8 wins isn't the goal. Championships is the goal. Championships are the expectation if you talk to former players around here. But at the same time, I'm sticking with him, and I'm going to see what I can get out of that defense with probably some fresh faces in there on the coaching staff. And we'll see what happens. At the same time, there's no excuse for what's happened this year.
And a couple close rivals might prove to be teaching moments of sorts. When you look at Notre Dame and Brian Kelly, they went 4-8 in 2016. They kept him on board, and he had a very similar resume and track record at Notre Dame prior to 2016 than Jim Harbaugh. He did get to a BCS championship game with a pretty thin schedule, and things worked out for him. But other than that, a pretty comparable record and run of time at Notre Dame prior to 2016. He has the big down year. Then they retain him. They revamp the staff. They come back, and they come back better over the last few seasons. And then looking in the mirror at another rival in Penn State, similar narrative that they can't get past Ohio State, although they did in 2016, but generally can't, and are playing second fiddle in the division, but still finishing top 10 to 15 in the country, going to New Year's Six bowl games. And now they've hit the skids at 0-5. What do you make of this Penn State situation? Because I don't know that there are two teams in the country, and they seem to they're now on the same field Saturday, that look more different today than what we anticipated them looking. And it's easy to see the personnel losses and the injuries on the Michigan side that are kind of spread all over the field. With Penn State, it's pretty much bam, best running back Journey Brown gone. Best defensive player, maybe the best defensive player in the Big Ten, Micah Parsons, opts out, gone. And then even Journey Brown's backup, Noah Cain, a top 5 running back coming out of high school, plays a series, and he's gone. So the star power lost immediately at Penn State, and they go from a top 10 team that loses a fluky game that might have just caved in the season, because then they circled the Ohio State game, of course, but they were then in a position that they had to win that game. They don't. So what are they playing for? So we don't know what we're getting out of Penn State, how much of it's them not being good enough, and how much of it is just lack of motivation and incentive at this point.
Yeah. And if you go back a year, the marquee games in college football were Michigan, Notre Dame, and Michigan blows out Notre Dame. Fast forward a year, and Notre Dame's number 2 in the country, and we'll see what they are in the college football playoff rankings tonight. Penn State, Michigan was the week before that. Michigan loses a heartbreaker, 28-21 in Happy Valley. And fast forward a year, Notre Dame, like I said, top 4 team, playoff contender, undefeated. Michigan and Penn State's winless. So it's amazing how much can change in a year, and it's just par for the course, I guess, in 2020. But that's the question about this Penn State team. There's still plenty of talent there, just like Michigan. What are they going to get out of this team? Are they playing? Do they have any pride left to play for? I happen to believe they're going to come out and play pretty well on Saturday. Considering what they have, they're kind of shuffling some quarterbacks around. They're still trying to push some buttons. But James Franklin, man, I mean, that's kind of the comparison. A lot of Michigan fans that were anti-Jim Harbaugh really after that 2017 season. I wouldn't say anti-Jim Harbaugh, but still had some serious questions, and I think are completely valid here in 2020. But we're looking at James Franklin and saying, man, he's won a Big Ten championship. They had the kick block against Ohio State, like you mentioned, in 2016. Jim Harbaugh's got a better record head-to-head against James Franklin, but that was kind of the comparison. Now, James Franklin is having more of a disaster season than Jim Harbaugh. He has the off-the-field controversy that came out last week within their program. So there's probably more heat on James Franklin from Penn State than there is on Jim Harbaugh, I guess you say, after a Rutgers win, just because, the national media is not going to talk about that, but just because of the disaster of a season they've had. So similar, though, like you mentioned, with the opt-out to Micah Parsons, the injuries to, now Pat Freiermuth, Journey Brown, Noah Cain. So what are we going to get out of this Penn State team? I have no idea. Like I said, I happen to think that they're going to show up for this game. And I happen to think Michigan's going to show up too, and they're kind of riding the momentum. They just needed any sort of win last week against Rutgers. So we'll see what kind of pride there is left to play for Penn State. But I agree with you. It's crazy that these two teams, how much they've fallen, I guess, in the last 365 days since the last time they played.
Meanwhile, you've got a star wide receiver at the high school level that's going to be at the Iron Bowl, which I believe is played in Tuscaloosa this year. I'm losing track of which direction. But anyway, Auburn-Alabama game. And absolutely, it can't be a good scene when Michigan's faltering against the likes of Michigan State and others, and you've got one of your top commits going to take in that spectacle, which obviously is going to be compromised by the lack of fans, but still, it's Auburn, Alabama.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. Xavier Worthy, he's a top 100 wide receiver, super fast, super athletic, super twitchy, is going to, add an element that I think Michigan's offense really needs at this point. He's not super small like some of these Michigan wide receivers are. He's committed. He's been fully locked in. There hasn't been a ton of concern from him outside of the fact that he's far away in California. He visited Michigan a couple of weeks ago on his own dime. He was set to come back the next week when a bunch of other commits were on campus in Ann Arbor. And then last second said, no, it's an expensive trip and it's completely understandable coming from California. Not going to come. I was there last week. There hasn't been a lot of concern. Well, it comes out yesterday that, Xavier Worthy is going to be at the Iron Bowl visiting. He can't talk to the coaches there, obviously, with the recruiting dead period, but he'll be at the game because the SEC is allowing fans, unlike the Big Ten. And, basically he has a great relationship with Josh Gaddis, Michigan's offensive coordinator, but there's been questions about every single coach on this staff. We talked about it. Is Jim Harbaugh going to be back at Michigan next year? How much heat is on Jim Harbaugh? All these kids hear the noise. So he's wondering, is my offensive coordinator and wide receivers coach, Josh Gaddis, the guy that I committed to and the guy I want to play for, is he going to be in Ann Arbor next year? He kind of wants a fallback option. And Alabama's been right there. He's been offered by every big school in the country. And he's going to take a look at them. Now, interestingly enough, I think he'd be the third or fourth rated wide receiver in that Alabama class. So, that's an interesting aspect to it too. He'd be the top ranked wide receiver in Michigan's class. I think there's some concern with him going there and attending that game. And, you get on campus somewhere and you never know what can happen. So he will be there. He's still locked in with Michigan for now, but I think he kind of wants a fallback option in case, stuff does hit the fan and in Michigan, loses their entire coaching staff or Josh Gaddis for some reason isn't here next year. But an interesting development that I think that we didn't see coming, 48 hours ago.
Xavier Worthy is the 10th rated wide receiver in the country, according to Rivals, 57th rated player overall, regardless of position. So that's a pretty rarefied air out of California. Clayton Sayfie joining us to talk Maize and Blue. Michigan takes on Penn State. Doesn't have nearly the weight anywhere close to it that it typically does. Penn State, Michigan at noon Eastern time. Clayton, we appreciate you stopping by, breaking down Michigan football. We shall be in close contact and intrigued about what happens the rest of the season into the offseason there in Ann Arbor.
Thanks for having me, Mark. A lot of fun. Let's do it again.